The land hadn't seen rain in 6 weeks. Dust rose with every hoof-step like breath from old bones, and the wind came dry and whispering, as if it knew something no one dared say aloud. Thomas Hank stood at the edge of his ranch, arms crossed over his chest, hat low against the brittle sun. Below him, in the lower paddock where the earth cracked like old leather, his mare limped again. Thomas Hank watched her from the rail fence, arms folded, jaw tight. His boots dug deep into dry earth, though he hadn't moved in a while. The horse, Junebug, favored her left hind leg. Again. The same leg that had never quite healed right. The swelling looked angry this time. Inflamed. Unnatural. She'd been his wife's horse once, back before the fire, back before grief set in like winter in bone. Back before he'd left and come back, older and quieter. The mare had lived long, too long, some said. But Thomas knew better. Some creatures just refused to die until they were done carrying the truth. He hadn't called the vet. The sun slipped low, washing the fields in copper and gold. Junebug limped past the gate, the wind brushing her mane like fingers through wet hair. He whispered more to himself than her. "I know what this is." He turned when he heard the screen door creak. Evie stood barefoot on the porch, her braid unraveling, arms crossed. 17 going on 70 in her eyes. The last of his blood kin. His sister's girl. She squinted out toward the mare, then back at him. "She's worse," Evie said softly. Thomas nodded. "You're not gonna call anyone?" He didn't answer. The silence between them had weight. Familiar weight. She stepped down into the dirt, moved beside him, close but not touching. Her gaze stayed on the horse. "She's hurting." "I know." Evie looked up at him, then down at his hands. Scarred knuckles, a missing fingertip from some forgotten winter. Hands that had done things he never spoke of. Her voice dropped. "This the same leg from back then?" Thomas didn't respond, but his jaw flexed. "She was gone a week, right?" Evie asked. "Back then." He exhaled slow. "Came back on her own. With blood on her flank. She waited, but he didn't speak again. The kind of silence that told you there were things he'd take to the grave, not because he didn't feel them, but because he did. And because shame, when old enough, grows its own roots. That night, Junebug lay down in the dust. She didn't rise. Thomas brought a lantern out and sat beside her. He didn't speak. Just ran a damp cloth down her neck and let her wheeze against his boots. The swelling on her leg pulsed. Her eyes met his in the dark, and it struck him how much she'd seen. How many winters she'd outlasted. How many secrets she'd carried without ever once bucking them off. He murmured her name once, "Girl!" and she blinked slowly, like she'd heard something deeper beneath the sound. The next morning, the wound broke open. It wasn't like any infection he'd seen. Pus, yes. But within it, threads of dark, fibrous tissue, almost rope-like. He reached in with gloved fingers, and Evie, watching from behind her braid, stepped forward despite herself. "What is that?" "Chain," Thomas whispered. They pulled together, slow, breath-tight. Out came a rusted necklace. The locket was crushed flat, but still held together. A child's whittled wooden rabbit was tangled in the links, its ear snapped, a name faintly scratched in its belly. "Ruthie," Evie read aloud, voice barely audible. Thomas stared at it like it might bite him. His fingers trembled. He closed the locket gently, held it for a long time, and then walked away without a word. That evening, he lit the old lantern. Sat at the table where no one had eaten in years. Junebug lay outside, her leg wrapped in cloth and mystery, her eyes glassy but calm. The rabbit sat on the table beside the lantern, casting a small shadow against the wall, childlike, head bowed. Evie waited until the silence cracked. "She was 14, wasn't she?" He blinked, slow. "Ruthie," Evie said. "The girl who vanished. Folks used to whisper." Thomas nodded once, as if against his own will. "You knew her." He took a long breath, looked past her, toward the window, toward the fields that knew too much. She came here one night, he said. Summer storm. Thunder loud enough to hide a scream. His voice was thick, uneven, like an old phonograph winding to life. She was bleeding, he said. Said her uncle meant to kill her. Said he'd done worse already. I was 24. Dumb. Full of fists and empty promises. Evie didn't speak. She sat down across from him, slowly, like the table was sacred ground. I told her she could stay, Thomas said. Kept her in the loft. Brought her food, blankets. Junebug stayed up there with her. Slept beside her like a dog. He looked down, as though remembering some other version of himself, one who had believed he could protect something just by standing near it. Third night, he continued, her uncle came. Knew she was here somehow. Kicked in the barn door with a shotgun and blood on his coat. She screamed. Junebug charged at him. I grabbed the gun. Then he trailed off. Then Evie asked, barely breathing. I don't know. It was chaos. I got shot. She ran. He chased her into the hills. When I woke up, she was gone. Junebug came back a week later, limping, blood on her flank. Evie blinked slow. And you never told anyone. Thomas's eyes were steel. What was I gonna say? That I let her run? That I failed her? Her uncle was well-liked. She was a half-wild girl with no mother and no voice. He looked down. I buried it. Same way Junebug buried that chain. Evie whispered. But you didn't forget. No. Thomas got up. Walked to the door. But he lingered there a moment longer than usual, one hand on the frame, as if asking permission from the house before stepping into the night. You should have told, she said. I know. Junebug stood the next morning. Barely. But she walked to the gate on her own. Evie came out holding the rabbit and the locket in a cloth. We should find where she died, she said. Thomas didn't speak, but he saddled the other horse. He paused longer at the saddle horn, fingers drifting over the worn leather like it might speak back. They rode east, past the broken fence line, into the hills. The air smelled of pine and wet dirt. Birds stopped singing as they approached an old twisted oak. Thomas dismounted. Walked forward slow. The earth here was uneven. A small mound, barely more than a wrinkle. Just enough to trip over if you weren't paying attention. But Thomas had never forgotten it. She's here, he said. How do you know? She was the only thing I ever failed that didn't come back. They dug with bare hands. The earth was damp underneath, clinging to their fingers. Stones, roots, silence, bones, small. Torn fabric still clung to one hip. The thread was faded orange. Evie pressed the locket and rabbit into the shallow grave. Thomas whispered something neither of them could remember afterward. They covered the earth again. No marker. No stone. Just the oak and the wind. The sheriff came 2 days later, after Evie insisted. Confirmed the man, Ruthie's uncle, had died in Missouri a decade ago, heart failure. No charges. No trial. The law didn't reach backward. But the truth had a way of standing upright, even after the body didn't. Thomas stood at the barn that night. Junebug nuzzled his chest softly, then turned and walked without a limp into the dark. He looked down at his hands. I should have brought her home, he said. Evie, from the doorway, answered him. You did. She walked to him. They stood side by side beneath a quiet sky. No stars tonight, just clouds and wind and the hush that comes when something has finally been said out loud. The dusk was violet and strange. Crickets tuned their legs like violins. The porch light flickered once, then held. Somewhere in the pasture, the mare stopped and looked back. And the wind shifted, soft as breath.